Jess, how much do you wish you lived in Ireland right now?
After you've told me about the thing that we're going to be advertising today, kind of a lot.
Right? Let me tell you about this amazing comedian, Bláithín de Burca, who has strong opinions, much like you and I.
Yes, we know something about that.
Yes, we certainly do. She is sassy. She has opinions on everything from dick pics to gender politics. And she has an amazing show called Blah Blah Blah. And she has special guests. On July the 3rd, they're discussing Pride is Dead? ? And Bláithín has a really great format, much like you and I. She has herself and 3 guests, one who has studied and done the doctor of the topic they're discussing, one person who has lived experience or is in performance or a creative kind of take on that topic, and then another person who is a total wild card who, much like me on this podcast, will probably just try and be funny and somewhat informed. So it sounds amazing. I hope to make the July 3rd show myself, and you can check that out on Instagram, being_blah blah blah. That's being_blah blah blah. And tickets are available on Eventbrite if you search blah 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 with special guests. Did I mention it's in Dublin? This is the worst ad ever. She'll refuse to give me a free ticket.
So yes, if you're in Dublin or near Dublin, go check that out. I'm very sad that I can't because I'm too far away, but it sounds great. So go along to that if you can, and maybe Grace will see some of you there.
See you there, Bláithín. Bye.
Bye.
Hi everybody, and thank you for tuning into today's episode. As with many things around politics and reproductive rights, some things have changed since this episode was recorded. It was recorded on the 27th of April 2022, and for an up-to-date perspective on reproductive rights in Northern Ireland, we'd recommend you check out allianceforchoice.com. That's alliance4choice.com. The second thing we'd like to tell you about today is that we have some content warnings for this episode. Specifically, rape and suicide gets a bit edgy, but also this episode is a bit of a difficult listen in terms of bureaucratic violence and people's ridiculous opinions about forcing women to carry to full term non-consensually. If you can't deal with that today, all respects for you, and we love you for taking care of your boundaries. If you carry on with us, we hope you enjoy this great chat with my friend Emma Campbell.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Women versus Everything. This is a women's history podcast where we talk about badass women from any period of history. We share their stories, we talk about the things that they overcame, the things that they achieved. And how this usually works is that one of us chooses a woman from any period of history, goes away and researches her story, and the other one researches the context and the time and the place and all of those things. And then we stitch it all together on air and see what happens. But we're doing something a little bit different today. We've got another interview episode. So I'm going to hand over to Grace to introduce our fabulous guest.
Yes, and a very big welcome to friend of the podcast, Emma Campbell.
Hello, everyone, and I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I mean, Emma, what a fucking bio. So you're an activist artist and you're doing a PhD utilizing photography and performance as a sexy magical tool for abortion rights, along with Alliance for Choice. And you're a co-convenor of Alliance for Choice. Emma's on the board of directors for Outburst Queer Arts here in Northern Ireland and the 343 Queer Feminist Space. You've had solo shows in Berlin and Dublin and Belfast, and group shows in London, Liverpool, Donegal, Belfast, Dublin, Stockholm, Bangkok, and street art and online, and got a documentary photography BA honours from Newport and MFA in photography from Ulster University. And you work as a professional photographer and a picture editor in London for 10 years for the BBC and the Times London and Network Photographers before your adventures now in Northern Ireland. And as a member of Array, you were 1/11th winner of the 2021 Turner Prize for the Druiithaib's Ball. Fab, I feel like clapping.
Oh my goodness, so much good stuff. Love this.
So many questions to ask you, and also the biggest quantifier in my opinion is Emma's been an amazing friend for me. She's we've only known each other since the start of the pandemic, and you've just been fantastic with regards advice and support, and you've been part of our podcast creation. I used you as a sounding board, and when we had challenges with the podcast in early episodes, you were a big champion. So thank you so much. And you were in the back of my mind from day one as someone I really wanted to interview on this.
Well, it's beautiful to see how far it's come, and it's honestly just such a joy to be here.
Yay! We've not done an episode on Northern Ireland, actually. So outside of all your fantastic achievements, something I was really interested in learning was just about the culture of Northern Ireland and what it's like being socialised and raised as a woman or a non-mask person in that environment. We've got listeners from all over the world. I think our second biggest listener base at the moment is America. So we'll get to all the amazing complex things you do later. But I mean, coming right down to the grassroots, can you talk a little bit about what the culture is like in Northern Ireland and how it's different to the UK or Southern Ireland, which is mine and Jess's experience?
Well, we all only have our own upbringing to compare to ourselves or some people nearby, but after living over in England and Wales for a long time, it was very, very easy to see. It's not like you're escaping patriarchy or macho culture when you're in either of those countries, but I just think the legacy of living in somewhere with such huge parts of the community involved in armed conflict means that the culture was a lot more macho. And it certainly grew up in an area just really close to the centre of Belfast, in East Belfast, and absolutely very macho. I was born in the late 70s, grew up in the 80s, so I can't remember because I'm terrible at working out years, but I think it was 17 or 18 or something when the Good Friday Agreement was made. So every time you went into town, you had to get through a turnstile where there were young lads, probably not even often that much older than you, in the army from England and Scotland and Wales, checking through your bags, or sometimes making, you can imagine, inappropriate comments as you were going through the turnstile. And then even when it wasn't the soldiers, it was, your local community, or it was just always seeing this very, Ian Paisley was in full swing when I was growing up. So this very fire and brimstone macho version of Christianity as well. I think so. It kind of permeated everything, really. I think I went to a girls' school, and though I might not necessarily agree with that sort of segregation now, I'm sort of glad that I did, because I feel like I do wonder how much extra space we were given in that school to be opinionated and outspoken and happily, openly nerdy without any particular consequence that might have happened from maybe having to fit into a more, I don't know, gendered hierarchical school environment. I don't know. I don't know because I only experienced the one. But my general opinion when I moved back to Northern Ireland was, oh wow, it's still openly macho and sexist here. Whereas I think, a bit like racism and homophobia and other kinds of bigotry, most people know to measure themselves, even if they do have those opinions now. Well, certainly until Trump became so popular globally, but I feel like that sense hadn't reached the north yet, maybe. And I do think it's something to do with our political leaders, in particular the DUP, being so themselves so openly sexist, so openly homophobic, so openly xenophobic. I think, of course, that's going to then give allowances to people, everyday people, then, and how they express themselves. But also, I think one of the issues in any context where there's been civil unrest and also state violence for such a long time is that we had very low people migrating to the north. I mean, I know Ireland as a whole had the same problem, but it was even more kind of exaggerated in the north because people left in droves, or people like me went away to university and never came back again quite frequently. And so you end up with a slightly older, more conservative population who are very kind of myopic and inward looking. Obviously, that's a huge generalization, and there's always been subcultures and there's always been people railing against that, especially in the queer community and the feminist community. But in general, yeah, I think I come from a Protestant background, and that culture is really problematically, violently macho, I'd say, within their own communities as much as they are against other communities. We have a huge problem with suicide and mental health in Northern Ireland, and yet we get the lowest funding of anywhere in the UK and Ireland for mental health per capita. So these things are related. I think these things are related, and I think many young men who didn't end up involved in paramilitaries sort of feel like it was a lucky escape or had reasons not to be involved. But young women get involved too, either directly as as militants or combatants, but also through sex work or drugs, or there's loads of other ways in which those macho parts of our communities that are still thriving in the north have a stranglehold on people. So it's unfortunate. But I kind of feel like when I lived in London, those same things happened, but it wasn't necessarily because of a sectarian conflict, but because people, have been ghettoized, and then they form gangs and they have their own community rules and community hierarchies. And I feel like that kind of gang communities pop up anywhere where, if people don't feel like they're being listened to or recognized or valued by the state, then they just begin to form their own communities. And quite often they can be quite flawed, especially if they're a mirror image of the things that they're actually railing against. So, and then there was a huge problem after the Good Friday Agreement because, for good reason, there were lots of prisoner releases. But what happened in many communities is that lots of women had been running the community centres and cooperative run creches and all sorts of really interesting things that were happening in the communities that the women were holding together. And then, this didn't happen necessarily everywhere, but it was common enough that people who were released because of the Good Friday Agreement then would come in and the men would then take over the communities again, and some of them went into regression. The good work that lots of the women's groups had done, and lots of fear was reinstilled back in those communities that had maybe been dampened down for a while, ironically. So it's complicated. Yeah.
Very complicated, but I think you've given a great overview there of the vicious cycle of like not belonging and othering that happens as a result of the violence, but the violence is also a response to it, and that vicious cycle of having to leave the community, but then nothing changes in the community because anyone who has the power to change it has just felt so othered they had to leave. And yeah, I really identify with that as well.
Most of the queer men that I knew from here in London, they were from here, is what I mean. They were. I had a very high percentage of my friends that were from Ireland that were queer over in London because they didn't feel like they belonged north and south, to be honest. But
Yeah, certainly. But it seems to have pervaded with the north on a level that, yeah, I've only been to Northern Ireland once, but that was my impression of it as well, is it felt like maybe like around the blatant homophobia and sexism and the small town mindedness, it felt more like Ireland maybe 15 years ago, the part of Ireland I'm from 15 years ago. And I was really shocked at that because geographically it's so close, but culturally it was so different.
yeah, and like, the Women's Coalition did their best, and there's been lots of really amazing kind of queer subculture things. There's the War Zone Centre, which was like an anarchist punk place that's really vibrant. Like, we've always had a really vibrant alternative or punk or underground scenes happening, but they're never enough to, you can't address everything that way. So
Yeah, of course. How do you marry that activism between like the grassroots punk anarchaic stuff and the intellectualism prize winning, more mainstream stuff? How's that journey been for you?
before we even decided we were a collective, we, as Array Studios, we always kind of felt like we were the naughty corner of even the
Mm.
art studios in Belfast, and quite a lot of them are naughty anyway. And we quite almost stubbornly wanted to hold on to our own unique identity because we were particularly concerned with doing rallies and being present and helping out with active groups in any way that we could. And the thing that I think we will have to explain less in Ireland, but certainly we had to explain it a little bit more in England. Like, we weren't artists who were doing community work with communities that we were like flown in to like do work with. The campaign for LGBT equality and the campaign for abortion rights, as you know, was part of the fabric of our culture for a good 10 years. I mean, certainly they were ramped up, and it was a slow burner for the first 5, but of the 2010s. But it wasn't like we decided to do this community work. We were the parts of those community. We were people directly affected. We were the people who wanted to, and you know, also things like the Language Act and things about mental health or the NHS that we were protesting about. It always felt like we were doing it because it was pertinent to us and it was meaningful and it was authentic, and we weren't doing it as a class project or a thesis or in fact, there was such a huge gap in my in me completing my thesis because I abandoned it for activism for a while because it was too hard to do both at the same time. And I think
very relatable.
So
Deeply relatable.
So I think, you know, some people think that we marry those two sides well, and some people, like the art establishment in England, weren't very happy with our DIY and protest aesthetic. They felt like we were somehow undermining the value of the Turner Prize. I mean, there's a scandal almost every year with the Turner Prize, so we were sort of half expecting it. But I think there's a couple of us who do kind of postdoc study or postgrad study, and I think sometimes it's directly relatable, and sometimes, you know, a lot of people in Belfast find the PhDs useful because it gives you the space to practice your art without having to be sidetracked by a full-time job, which, you know, is the only way most of us survive here when we're not studying. So there's a little, I don't know, I think just we want to make sure that what we do is carefully thought about, and thought about with care as well. And sometimes that involves thinking, well, who's done this before? Who's thought about this before? But sometimes it means having really open and honest conversations amongst the collective or with other people as well. So sometimes it works and sometimes that's more tricky. And I think the academic side is probably low on our list of priorities. I would say that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which makes sense for when you're living in the community and you can feel the urgency of the action that needs to be taken. I'm thinking of our episode on Margaret Prescott, where she was a woman of colour in a community where women that looked like her were being murdered and the police weren't doing anything about it. But it was a white woman writing an article was what exposed everything, you know, and that divide, and it is a class divide between those two things, you know, the activism and the intellectualism. Yeah.
Nobody was being murdered, obviously. So, but there, you know, we have felt this kind of neither fish nor fowl type of in betweenness about Northern Ireland, where in Britain they don't want to talk, and certainly they do not teach anything about the colonial aspects of the issues with Ireland. They still think that the, you know, two religious sides decided to start fighting, and, you know, they don't have the full appreciation of Britain's purposeful and central role in creating that conflict.
It's honestly shocking how little we learn here about all the various fucked up things our country has done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we had, you know, there is also a huge Irish diaspora, and we thought we might get emotional responses to the work in Array from Irish diaspora, but we were kind of pleased and surprised that we had such emotional resonance with people who'd never set foot on the whole island, never mind in the north. But it'll be interesting, and we're going to show the work in Galway in the summer, and it'll be interesting to see how people react to the work in Ireland, because and it's partly why we want to show it in Ireland as well, because there's a certain amount of looking away that's interesting, and we feel like should be maybe teased apart a little bit as well, you know. Especially for the part of the population that feel themselves to be fully Irish, but feel always left out of conversations about Ireland. So yeah, that should be interesting.
Can you talk a bit about what it's like so Array is a creative activist collective. Can you talk a bit about things that help an activist collective to function, and maybe speaking a bit to like activist burnout as well?
I mean, I wish I had a good answer to the burnout question, but so I'll not go there first. But we realized after a project we did in London for the Jerwood, which was called Collaborate, which was the first time we really had to translate our kind of street-based actions or community-based actions into a white cube gallery space. And so it was really trial and error way of working together for that. Normally we're reacting quite urgently and, as you said, in response to things, or we can be a bit playful when we're on the streets. We can be a bit more cheeky, I suppose. And so
Mm.
how do you translate that energy into a white cube space, but how can you also keep 11 people on board and happy with the idea, and everybody gets a chance to feel like they have a role and a stake in everything, and that their ideas are properly represented, and it's not just one person. There's a lot of big personalities in Array, but there's also a few people who are very creative but not very outspoken. And so we learned very quickly that we had to figure out ways of making sure they had the chance to say something, but also that they weren't forced into it either. And I think that it was really helpful that we had that before we had to do the Turner project, because then we were like, okay, Slack is hideous on one hand, but at the same time, it keeps all the conversations in one place, because we weren't keeping up on WhatsApp threads. You can lose loads of information. And then that's for like the fast stuff. And then for the slow, let's have a think about ideas, there are Google Docs, because bear in mind, we did most of this or all of this work under lockdown. But
Mm.
we know that when we meet in person, and as many of us as possible meet in person, that we always feel less, as a collective, there are less anxieties, because, we all know that their Zoom meetings are a really great backup, or they're really good for accessibility. Like, a few of us have kids, a few of us have had COVID through the pandemic, a few of us have had other mental health needs that just meant that we can't meet in person. So Zoom is great for accessibility, but also meeting in person is really helpful for all those little somatic things that go on between people that we just don't really know or understand or how to describe yet. We get a better sense of how people are feeling when you're in person. You get a better sense of somebody explaining themselves. We tried a few different ways of coming to decisions and ways of talking about things. And then we divide into subgroups so that not everybody's doing everything all the time, because that would definitely burn people out. So, and we played our strengths. There's no point in me working on the install, because I have a terrible 3D mind. Just don't have that capacity. And there's no way I would have been on the sewing canopy team as well, because I'd probably make the sewing machine explode. But but I think the other thing is, when we had big meetings in person, we made sure that we were eating together, and we go out and have drinks together, and we turn research trips into kind of social activities together. And I think that it really helps. We were really privileged as well that we were able to have such a large bubble through some really tough parts of
Mm.
lockdown. Now, the first part, we didn't even know we were nominated during the very first rough lockdown, but so we met with each other every Friday. I think it was every other one was in person and every other one was on Zoom, and that really helped. I mean, there was a lot to get through. It did feel overwhelming. Every single one of us has at least a full-time job or a part-time job and education and a family, and so there's all these commitments happening at once. I think 5 of us moved house during the project. 2 people gave birth the week before the opening. There was a lot going on for Array in 2021. But we have a couple of threads on the Slack. One is a random crack thread, which is just nonsense or hilarious things, and the other one is a heads turned. I don't know if you use the phrase in the South, but like, if your head's turned, you're like, your mental health's not good. So we have
Mm.
a heads turned thread, and people post in there just like, listen, it's not good for me this week, or something's happened, or I'm feeling really anxious about this thing, or work's giving me a hard time, and they can tell I'm not fully engaged or whatever. So we have that space that people can be quite open. We have a big access document as well, which includes lots of things like people's, nut allergies, right down to people's neurodivergence and things as well. So things that we will give people allowances for, childcare. So we do try and make sure that care is woven through what we do, I suppose.
I love that.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I
that's
went off on a
brilliant.
tangent in the middle there, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing like two things. I'm hearing care and time. I think under capitalism, everything is very snap decisions. And, I was just looking at a thread earlier about how, they use this very flawed, is it WinRAR test to measure how people can make snap decisions even before an interview. And time is applauded under capitalism, but actually for longevity and lasting project, I'm hearing that, it's okay if it takes a few weeks to organize a resources trip, or why don't we wait longer to do this so that we can make sure we can eat together. And it's about forming habits and forming relationships and forming an intimacy, I'm really hearing.
Yeah, I mean, we've never, I don't think, oh no, maybe one year we had a Christmas dinner at Christmas, but regularly our Christmas dinner happens in spring. But we just make sure that we all can make it. So that's the most important thing, that everybody can physically be there, and then we just wait until everybody can. So, and when we're doing other things like installing exhibitions or going to rallies, it doesn't always have to be all 11 of us. The likes of other events that happened, like International Women's Day, we knew that maybe only 5 of us could be there, but we also knew we have array adjacent people who will also turn up and hold banners and signs. And the thinking about doing the Druiithaib ball and holding an event in Belfast and filming it there first is, in our minds, we felt like the work that we did also needed to include the people that we work with, so other artists, activists, and we didn't think that the exhibition in Coventry would be very accessible for people in Belfast, especially during lockdown, especially because you have to fly. So part of the reason we did what we did was because we wanted to make sure that our communities could be part of it, could actually experience it as well. So they were all asked to come. There was, I think, I can't remember how many guests because I'm terrible with numbers, maybe 50-ish. But they were all asked to come in a costume that was related to the wake of the centenary of partition of Ireland. And some were quite direct translations and some were much more abstract. I think we had a centipede. We had a 15 Triebake, which is a bit like a rocky road. That was really important to us because inclusion extends beyond the 11 of us, and we've always really felt that. And it almost felt a bit weird when we completely shockedly it felt a bit odd not to be in Belfast. Like all the cracks seemed to be happening there. And we weren't there amongst, our friends and comrades or whatever. Yeah, we're delighted that we're going to be able to show it in Galway, and then it's going to have a big homecoming to Belfast.
It's exciting.
Yeah, amazing.
So my next question was going to be like, what advice would you give to artists that might be looking to start their own collective or activism collective?
Honestly, we were in the studios, but we were also friends first. Belfast is small, so I can't remember what the population is compared to Cork or whatever, but it's really like you pretty much get to know everybody here. When I came back to the north from London, a way of me getting to know people was I would go out to the late night art events that would happen on the first Thursdays of every month, which still happen the first Thursdays, as a way of getting to know other people. And honestly, there's a couple of people in the collective, I'm not really 100% sure how we met. I just know that we've been friends for a long time and late night art had something to do with it. There's two sisters in the group, there's a couple, I think there's even a few exes from the mists of time, but like people who went to uni together. I worked with some of the people, so we're all friends and have connections anyway. The studios didn't always have this configuration of people, but a couple of people moved out and a couple of people moved in around about 2014, I think it was. Space was opening up a little bit with residencies, and both of us, Tom and myself, who did the residencies, then just stayed and didn't leave the studios. And at that point, suddenly we had, sort of accidentally, we had a group of people who all just kept turning up. Like at first we weren't organizing that we were going to these rallies and protests. We were just all turning up to the same ones, all mostly in costume. So it became, it was very sort of organically that we became a collective. Now we have a few very basic rules now, which I'll send you the little motif about caring for each other and having a laugh and getting out and getting involved with your activist groups. That's it. But we never really thought, oh, we should write a manifesto or we should, anything like that. It was a bit more organic. And then when the Jarwood bursary came up, we're like, I suppose we might as well call ourselves the collective because we've been working collectively for a long time now. I think it's a little bit harder for young artists because the artist studios are being squeezed out of Dublin, squeezed out of Cork, squeezed out of Belfast city centre. And it's hard. There's so many examples. And there used to be, I think, 6 other artist studios in very close relation to where I'm sitting right now in Array Studios. But they've all had to move out. We've been given notice on our building, so we have to move out in less than a year for development. So office blocks, you know the score. It's happening all over Ireland. So, and a lot of the work we've been doing is about gentrification. Long before our space was under threat, but just because we mapped out, we did a presentation for the Stormont Assembly, and I just wanted to give them a context of how the ecology of creative people works, because as you know yourselves, no one's ever just involved in one project, right? So people who are in Array are also in Household, and people who've been in Household are also in Catalyst. And so I wrote down all these organizations, and there were well over 50 organizations that were just because of the people involved, because of people in Array. And I just think that's really interesting. And if you start to squeeze the artists out of the centre of town, and you're squeezing, the impact on all the other organisations is going to be huge. And we've such close links and ties with the community and voluntary centre or sector. We're in them and we're part of them and we work for them and so forth. And the same thing's happening to them. They can't afford city centre buildings anymore, where in actual fact we need those community and voluntary groups in the town centre almost way more than we need more offices and more corporate building blocks. So I do feel sorry for the new artists, but I think organising collectively is probably the easiest way to get around that.
Do you want to talk a bit about your work for Northern Ireland for Choice as well? Very important.
Yes, topic. I'm desperate to hear more about this.
Yes.
So, the reason I got involved when I moved back in Northern Ireland is just because I had managed to be blissfully unaware of the lack of change when I went away. I do think as well, when you're, in your early 20s and you move away from somewhere, part of the reason of staying in London was like somewhere where no one would know who I was. It wasn't a tiny little town. Came out in London long before I came out in Northern Ireland and all the rest, which is a fairly common tale as well. So I think I'd managed to keep myself purposely, blissfully unaware of what was happening now in the north. And when I moved back, I was horrified to realise that still no abortion access here. That doesn't seem right. And I saw BBC Northern Ireland had a documentary where they interviewed a woman called Bernie Smith, who's the head of Precious Life in Northern Ireland, which are one of the anti-choice organisations. I was gobsmacked that she was getting away with saying all this medically inaccurate factually inaccurate things on television. And I'd already kind of gone to a few of the Belfast Feminist Network events, and through Belfast Feminist Network then I found the Alliance for Choice events, and so I turned up at some of them. And I'd come back to Belfast to do a master's project, because I really wanted to do one for ages, to be able to refocus my work back to the social justice perspective that I got into photography in the first place for, but I couldn't afford to do a master's in London. Someone from my background can't afford to work part-time in London and still pay the rent.
Yeah, and then tuition as well, of course. It's
exactly.
Bonkers how expensive it is.
Yes, I moved back here to do my master's, and they'd only just started it the year before. A guy who was running it phoned me up, asked me if I was interested, and I was like, not this year, but I can next year. So I came back and decided that I needed to do a project about abortion. I had no idea what I was going to do at the start, so I just kept turning up to things, and they kept giving me jobs, and I kept doing the jobs, and then I just became a member of Alliance for Choice that way. So Alliance for Choice had a pretty rough time in 2008 or they thought it was the last chance to get something through Westminster before the whole issue of crime, which abortion was under, was devolved to Northern Ireland. And the Labour Party did a deal with the DUP, which meant that the issue never even got heard properly. There was a lot of despondence because I moved back in 2010, so there's a lot of people who'd fallen away, and people just felt, well, if the Labour Party aren't going to do it, there's no way anybody else is going to do it over there for us, and it's certainly never going to happen by the hands of the DUP over here. So people felt really dejected and despondent, I think. So when I got started, they had begun to concentrate a little bit more in the arts anyway, so it's kind of judicious timing. It was just also happened to be the time when Mara Clark was restarting an abortion fund in England for people from Ireland, North and South. So there's a lot of fortune, good fortune, luck. So I ended up volunteering for a few years and then being co-chair as a volunteer still for a few years. Like you can imagine, it was very hard for us to get any funding. And then the lovely Quakers, Joseph Rowntree, gave us a small pot of funding for a community education project. And then we were able to get more people involved after that. And the more people we did the education project with, the more people wanted to become involved. And this was also mirroring the stuff that was happening with the abortion rights campaign in the South. And I had a solo exhibition of my master's project in the Copper House Gallery in Dublin. And through that, I met a wonderful woman called Siobhan Clancy, who I think lives in Cork at the minute. Actually, she was involved with this brand new abortion rights campaign organisation who were trying to reinvigorate the conversation around repealing the Eighth Amendment. And so she, on one of the talks she organised for my exhibition, she had like Alva Smith there and a couple of people from Outhouse, and it was just, she was brilliant at connecting then the North and making sure the North always had a significant voice in the abortion rights campaign in the South. So that was, it's very hard for me to separate my art and my activism because they've always been so hand in hand. And sometimes, sometimes the art has fallen a little bit to the wayside, but then at the same time, every single day, as you know, when you're producing material for social media, everything needs some sort of image. So even if I'm not doing my like official art, I've always been doing like the art of the art of the campaign, or however you would call that, the visual language of the campaign. So I find it really hard to separate it because, if you come to the movement and you're a lawyer, you're going to find it very hard to separate your law brain from how you think about the movement. And if you come as I don't know, like a policymaker, or if you come as someone who's running for election, like all of these, it's very hard to strip ourselves into nice little neat silos that can constitute ourselves. We're always playing things concurrently, I suppose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I would even argue that we shouldn't try to split ourselves off into those separate things because all of us, we contain multitudes, as the saying goes. So, we all bring these kind of different combinations of experiences and knowledge to the table. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I think certainly from the academic side, there can sometimes be the more traditional academics can have a bit of a resistance to that. And I think the great thing about the feminist scholarship, and there's been such a surge in it around the abortion movement in the whole of Ireland, has been this really purposeful and again careful situating people, contextualizing your own position, openly being subjective but very clearly setting out your stall for who you are and where you come from and what your context is, rather than pretending those things don't exist. And I think that's a really key and interesting part of feminist scholarship as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of our listeners who maybe aren't so kind of aware of what's going on over there and sort of what the situation is at the moment, can you give us a kind of overview of where is the sort of fight for abortion rights at the moment? How is that? What's the situation right now? What's the kind of next phase of that as you see it?
So we now technically have one of the best laws in Europe, in the world. Yay! On paper, we should have abortion on request up to 12 weeks, any health or mental health reason up to 24 weeks, and then post 24 weeks for severe fetal complications or severe complications for the pregnant person. However, the DUP weren't very happy when this legislation got introduced and haven't funded anything. The Minister for the Department of Health is from the Ulster Unionist Party, and they're slightly more moderate than the DUP, but that particular guy who is the Minister for Health is Antichoice, and a couple of days after the new legislation was introduced here, he was filmed as part of the protest, which they called the Darkest Day. It was so frustrating for all of us pro-choice people in the north, which is most of us. So they all turned their social media profiles black for the day and said it was the darkest day in Northern Ireland. So
the listeners can't hear this because this is an audio medium, but I am rolling my eyes so hard right now.
yeah, like
Have they read a history book?
Decades of state violence, decades of violence within communities and towards each other's communities. Like, are they, were they for real? Like, what? So,
but no, people who can get pregnant having control over their body is the worst thing ever to happen. Dear God.
Jesus Christ.
And for us, it's always this, which exactly the same as the rest of the 26 counties in Ireland. Irish people have always been having abortions. They were just having them in England, or they were having them under less safe circumstances at home.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you making a law preventing it doesn't help lower the amount of abortions.
No.
All it does is make them probably be later, probably be less safe, and probably certainly cost a lot more money. It was so infuriating. It was so infuriating. And, the whole thing is nobody's ever going to be forced to have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
But when the law is changed, you can decide whether you want one or not, which for me is you're not going to be made to have an abortion. Nobody's going to make anyone have one. It should be up to that person. But anyway, I'm definitely preaching to the choir here. But so the problem
yes, but
is...
it's important to say, because that's, I think, the thing that people miss, really, is if an individual person is anti-abortion, like, okay, great, don't get one. Doesn't mean you have the right to force that choice on other people.
Mm.
Yeah, so where we are now, both north and south, is that people who need help after 10 to 12 weeks are still being made to travel over to England. Now, it is a smaller minority, and it is I think it's under 3% of people that need abortions need them after that cutoff date. But these are the people whose stories won the hearts and minds of the referendum.
Yes.
Whose stories were read out in the Assembly, whose stories were read out in the Houses of Parliament. These are the people that, for those who were on the fence and weren't really sure, changed their minds. And these are the people who mostly had wanted pregnancies, who then have had a terrifying, heartbreaking diagnosis at 20 to 22 weeks to tell them that the pregnancy can't continue in the way that they want it. And they're the people that we're denying access to at the minute. So frustrating. In the north, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has said that because the Department of Health in the north are refusing to move, they're just not doing anything. And they're using, I guess, the cloak or the cover of certain cross-community mechanisms that are in place in Northern Ireland because of sectarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Because of sectarianism, there's lots of kind of caveats in lawmaking where they have to make sure that both sides, in inverted commas, agree, so that no one community is forcing another community to take on board a policy. And it was to protect against harm, in each other's communities. But these kind of mechanisms are being used instead to prevent progression on human rights. So what's going to happen is the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who at the minute is Brandon Lewis, is going to intervene and basically go above the heads of the Department of Health. It's not necessarily the way Alliance for Choice never thought that our comrades would be the Tory party. It's a very bizarre situation to be in.
That is surprising.
It is also really bizarre that the DUP, so the party that are holding this back the most, are the party who want to remain part of the British, empire, the United Kingdom, be as close to Britain as possible, don't want what they call a border on the Irish Sea, do not want to have the same abortion legislation or laws like Britain, yet Sinn Féin, traditionally nationalist, traditionally want a united Ireland, traditionally want nothing to do with the United Kingdom, traditionally don't want anything to do with Britain and its legacy, are the people agreeing with the Tory party and saying, yes, you should intervene. It's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. But there we have it. So at the minute, most people in the north, unless they're in the Western Trust, so they just have no one there to provide it, they can't get a doctor to provide it, and they can't get the trust to fund it properly so that a doctor and a nurse will provide it.
So just to clarify on that, so even though it's technically legal up to these dates under these sort of circumstances, so individual healthcare providers can still refuse legally? Am I understanding that correctly?
So it's not that it's individual healthcare providers because it's all under the National Health Service here, but divided into health trusts geographically across the country. And the Western Trust, which covers basically anything that touches Donegal, had provision for, oh, I think it was 6 to 8 months, but they wouldn't properly fund and resource the staffing of the early medication abortion clinic. So
Mm-hmm.
the one singular member of staff that they had doing absolutely everything. So the doctor stroke consultant was also booking the appointments and doing the admin, and that's too much for one person to
Mm.
do. So she said, you need to get me some assistance and some resourcing, and they just didn't. In Northern Ireland, a lot of the ways that the institutions deal with things that they don't like is to just ignore them for ages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So just let's not do anything about it. So before we had this big legal change, the Department of Health for Northern Ireland took 11 years to publish guidelines for doctors and nurses on abortions in Northern Ireland.
Wow.
So that's like institutional delay. That bureaucratic delay for me, I would really describe that as bureaucratic violence.
Yes. Yes.
They do that quite a lot. So they use the system to create barriers, or they use the system to create delays, which is kind of where we are now. So you can get it in the rest of the trusts in the north up to 10 weeks, which again isn't even what the law says. But the only reason we even have that service is because there's a bunch of really amazing doctors and nurses and midwives and so on who decided that they would just set up these clinics. So they set them up during COVID. We got the law passed just before COVID, and the government tried to shut down the clinics that they opened. So we were like, okay, this is not okay. There were
Mm-hmm.
people during COVID when the law had just changed. We were ironically in a far worse situation than we'd ever been, because suddenly none of the medication was coming. So Women on Web and Women Help Women are NGOs, both based in the Netherlands, who provide the early medical abortion pills via an online doctor's consultation to anyone anywhere in the world where there's no access. But problematically, because there was a whole heap of manufacturing shut down in China and India, which is where all the pharmaceuticals were coming from, we were basically all phoning each other in the island of Ireland, like, who has abortion pills?
Oh my God.
Where can we get them to? People were being told to travel to England for abortions during the very first, even the very first lockdown.
Oh my God.
Flights were being cancelled. One woman had her flights cancelled twice, then tried to access it in a hospital in the north of Northern Ireland in Antrim, was refused, and then a couple of days later ended up in accident and emergency because she tried to not be alive anymore, essentially.
Oh God, that's terrible.
Yeah, but the problem is we'd said we're really concerned if you shut this down and there's no access here and there's no way to get to England. We're really concerned
Yeah.
that people will do. We said desperate things, because we knew before people pre-pills would have tried to drink bleach or taken concoctions that they found on the internet or get people to punch them in the
Yeah.
abdomen. Like, people did really desperate things because when you really don't want to be pregnant, you really don't want to be pregnant.
Which has been happening since the Victorian ages or
Yeah.
even before,
Yeah. So we were like, I mean, this is the least satisfying told you so, we've ever had. Like, we said this was going to happen. We warned you. And the
Mm.
combination of that and us saying, okay, fine. We managed to find a number of different sources for the pills. And we were like, look, we're just going to provide for it if you don't, as Alliance for Choice. And then some doctors spoke out. There were letters also behind the scenes. There was a lot of different pressure coming from different places, which really helped. Alliance for Choice could never have changed the law on our own. Same as the South, it needed legal minds, it needed medical
Mm.
minds, it needed the trade unions have been a massive help. It needed really brave people to speak out about their own personal experiences. But we feel really strongly that now that they've done that, they shouldn't have to do that again. um,
Mm-hmm.
so so eventually the government had tried to stop these clinics being opened, but eventually it was ruled that that wasn't legal. They weren't allowed to do that. And so the clinics opened in a kind of bare bones capacity. So most of the people working in those clinics were able to do it because they were redeployed because of COVID. So our worry is now that things are getting back to normal, that they'll be moved back into different areas of care. So,
Yeah.
but the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland had said if nothing happens by March 2022, then they would intervene. So March went and they were like, okay, now there's an election. So we'll wait till after the election. But they've already started talking to people about implementing services over here. So hopefully by the summer, we should have some form of services. Unfortunately, again, for Northern Ireland, it really depends on who gets voted in. So, because we have this forced coalition, if the DUP get the second most votes, they'll be forced into a coalition with Sinn Féin being the first minister and them being the deputy, holding the post of deputy. And they've already said that even though they were first and Sinn Féin were deputy for years, that they won't do it the other way around. Honestly, so childish, even when you explain it out loud.
Yeah. It seems like that, you know, with they want to be part of England, but they also want their own laws. It's that kind of like, I want my cake and eat it childish attitude from a ruling party, which is terrifying.
And also, I just, you know, it's for me, you know, with a step back, it's very clear, like, we've had power for this long and we are so scared of letting go of it. Like, they just don't want to let go of it. So, well, you know, it remains to be seen, but, you know, we're still here. We're still helping people in the Western Trust and people who fall through the cracks in the other trusts find their way to get proper access. We started a doula project called Look Karak, so trained 16 different people, some actually from the south, mostly from the north, a couple from England, who then went on to do their own doula project, which is brilliant. So now we have 4 active abortion doulas in the north. We have a phone line and a website. So because the problem is the Department of Health in Northern Ireland won't even publish information on the services that are currently legally available and accessible. So if you compare that to what happened in Ireland, once the referendum passed, there's a big campaign. There was a public health campaign. There were advertisements on like the buses and the Lewis, and there was a health helpline launch and everything. None of that has happened here. None of it. So
so even though it's technically legal, they're really pulling out all the stops to make it as difficult as they possibly can for people to access those services.
Yeah,
and bureaucratic violence is exactly the perfect term for it.
Such a great term.
And the Northern Ireland office as well have even asked Alliance for Choice to make sure we have all the up-to-date information on our website, because it doesn't exist anywhere else. So all the pathways for Northern Ireland don't exist anywhere else except on our website, which is ludicrous. I mean, we're happy to do it, but we're a tiny little NGO.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're going to run out of proper funding in about 6 months, or because obviously on paper, once we've got the law, people are less interested in funding us to do this boring bureaucratic trying to get things implemented type work.
And then where is all the funding that the health trust has gotten for that gone?
I don't know if they've had any yet. I think the department...
So they've just not even applied for the funding to start that process. So instead, all the funding responsibility falls on a small charity, basically.
So, I mean, we do get a number of phone calls. Most of the people, when they phone us, are like, I thought this was also supposed to be sorted out already. We're like, yeah. But we offer care packages as well. So we have sanitary pads and nice herbal tea and a bit of advice that we give to people if they want it. Not everybody wants the care package. We also offer to attend the clinics with people if they want, so that they can be helped safely through the protesters. The new bill on safe access zones, which was put forward by Claire Bailey from the Green Party, has passed. So we're just waiting for it to be properly implemented, which will also be after the elections. And I know that Together for Safety are campaigning for something very similar.
So what does that mean? What is that going to entail?
So that means that around anywhere that provides either abortion, healthcare, or counselling, or anything affiliated with it, there will be a certain space around that entry and around that building where you're not allowed to have anti-abortion protests or anti-abortion protesters or material or sound systems or you know, many of the things that they normally do. So we don't know when that's coming into effect, but they have, all the different groups have ramped up their campaigns. They always do over Easter anyway, so I think they're just trying to do as much as possible before the law comes in.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sure you have experience of that as well.
Yeah, we certainly do. Sometimes even still at Pride, the religious posters out, you know. Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't see as much of it in England. I've never had to access those services myself, so I don't I don't have direct experience of it, but we don't see as much of it, at least generally, I don't think. But there's definitely still real pushback, unfortunately, by certain people. I remember years ago, Grace, do you remember this? Did we know each other at this point? I don't remember. When I was living in Oxford, there was an event that the university put on one night that was a panel discussion all about, quote, pro-life feminism, which I did no, first of all. I don't see how those two things can possibly. And it was a mess, and a bunch of us kind of pro-choice feminists went along and essentially challenged them and asked them a bunch of questions, and yeah, it was depressing, shall we say.
I wonder, was it the same woman on tour? Because they had a woman whose name I can't remember who calls herself a pro-life feminist, an American woman, and they got me to debate her, and yeah, very much on the same page of you can't be a feminist and be pro-life because you're deciding for somebody else. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah.
It's a 2-sentence debate.
Yeah, but I wonder, was it the same woman at the same time? Because I'm sure she was on some sort of tour.
I think there was 3 of them, if I remember correctly. But I mean, we're talking about, I think this was 2013 or 14, so I can't remember the names. It was a long time ago. But I remember I challenged them specifically about cases of rape and sexual abuse, asked them what their stance was on that, and depressingly, they essentially said that, yeah, someone who's been, if they get pregnant, should still be forced to carry that pregnancy to term, and that's a lesser evil than abortion, which I don't see any universe in which that could be considered a feminist stance.
Yeah, there's a candidate running in Northern Ireland whose name I've forgotten, but she's running for Ian too. Do they run in the south as well?
I'm not sure.
They're basically a number of breakaway people who left Sinn Féin and formed a party pretty much based on pro-life politics. And she did an interview literally 2 days ago, I think, for one of the local newspapers that said, if you get pregnant through rape, then you should continue with the pregnancy. An abortion won't unrape you. It's just hideous, just absolutely hideous. But
Wow.
also the idea that what the person needs is like proper care and hostel and therapy, and you're like, you making someone go through with a pregnancy they don't want, no amount of therapy is going to help them, and
No.
we have a
Yeah.
case as well in the south of Miss Y where that exact thing happened, where they tried to make her continue the pregnancy. That was a really
Yeah.
horrific story, really, really horrific. So yeah, I don't hold any truck with those arguments, but it's very strategic on the part of the anti-choice people that they'll try and they'll see that the language of rights and the language of feminism becomes really popular, and so then they'll try and rework that kind of stance and logic back into their own campaigns, but it doesn't, most of them don't hold water through much logical reason. So
No.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, it sounds like your group are doing such amazing work, and it sounds like it's so desperately needed at the moment. So, if our listeners want to support you, how can they help? How can they get involved or donate? What do you need, and how can we help?
We have a crowdfunding page for Alliance for Choice on local giving, and our website that has lots of information is alliance4choice.com. And we're often holding events. We do online workshops as well for people, quite often train members of the public about what the abortion pills are, how to use them safely, like a harm reduction model that's used across the
Yep.
world. And we have a lot of art events and so forth. Yeah, some people have done, same as the repeal campaign, people have done really amazing things, like gigs where they'll then give a percentage of the door to us. We've done karaoke for choice before, which is one of my favorite things.
Yes.
I want to go. That sounds awesome.
And yeah, people have like had bake sales. The unfortunate thing is because of lockdown, there haven't been as many opportunities to do that kind of fundraising. But we also did some fundraising for, there's a huge problem that's happening because of the UK government, because their position on immigration impact the north as well. So we've done some fundraising for organisations that are actively trying to stop that. So the Lauren House Visitors Group and the End Deportations Belfast are both working really hard to try and mitigate the circumstances of people who are trying to seek asylum or refuge and then find themselves in awful, similar to direct provision detention centres in the north. So we try our best to always keep our arms open for solidarity with other groups. And
Mm.
we remember what it was like before, when we were too small to have a local given, or too small to, so we try and make sure that we are open to hosting that, letting other people use that platform, or our platform. And there's loads of really good student groups in the north as well. There's the Project Choice at Queen's University, and there's the Ulster University Pro-Choice Society, and we do loads of work with HereNI, who you mentioned, who are for lesbian and bisexuals, and also the Rainbow Project. Yeah, and Outburst Queer Arts is a brilliant arts organisation. So if any of your listeners are able to make it to Belfast and the North in general in late November, then they always have really incredible global act. Last year they did a gay mass requiem, with these massive projections, with the Ulster Orchestra in the middle of this big giant warehouse room, and then round the edges these projections where four different queer artists had made these beautiful kind of films that they projected around the edge. And I've never seen anything like it. It was one of the best things I've ever seen.
That sounds
Wow.
incredible.
Yeah, and I think Abomination was on in Dublin recently, and is hopefully traveling to London. It was the DUP opera, so yeah. So
Ah.
yeah, it's look out for that. It's really good. Connor just used the verbatim transcripts of a DUP woman being interviewed by one of our radio presenters up here, and then turned it into an opera, and it's fantastic.
Oh my God.
What a brilliant concept.
Yeah, so that
Uh-huh.
all that interesting stuff going on up here. Like John Waters was over one year for the event and did a talk. So, and obviously if you're anywhere near Galway in August, you can pop in and see an array show. And then if you plan to be in Belfast at all, practically the first 8 months I think of 2023, our show will be on in the Ulster Museum as well.
Amazing. So many ways to get involved. So we'll pop the link to your website in the description.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel so inspired.
Oh,
Jesus.
me too. It's amazing. So if you've got a few more minutes, what we normally do is finish with a lightning round with just a few of kind of the same questions that we ask everyone. You want to go for it?
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Awesome. So the first question is, what does feminism mean to you?
It means trying to build a world that is different from this one and recognizes everybody equally.
I love that.
Mm.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Ooh, that's tricky. Ooh, probably the best piece of advice was about not to always be imagining that where you are is a transition, or to appreciate where you are right now while you're in it, and not always think of it. You're not always on a travelator to somewhere else.
Mm.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic.
That's
I'm very
great.
bad at that, so gonna take that advice on board. Who is a woman that you admire and why?
Ooh, there's a couple of women that I interviewed for my PhD, and they're like invisible, unsung heroes. They're all queer women. They're all photographers, and they all worked in a collective called Format in the
Mm-hmm.
70s. One of them is Irish, Joanne O'Brien, and she photographed people in abortion clinics way back when. She did a whole project on the families and relatives of people who were killed on Bloody Sunday, and she's in her 70s and she's still out there making projects, doing work, doing her thing, being 100% Joanne O'Brien. She worked as a bus conductor in the 70s in London, and there's like a documentary of her. And she's just this incredible woman who pretty much hardly anybody knows about. But yeah, I
Love
think
her
Sounds like we need to
already.
do an episode about her.
I was gonna say, can she come on our show?
Yeah.
I think she'd love it. I think she's still on Twitter, and I did an interview with her ages ago, but I'm sure she's a way more to talk about since then. She's a really interesting perspective on what it was like to work as an Irish woman in London
Mm-hmm.
in the 70s and 80s in a mostly English collective.
Brave.
Yeah.
Fucking brave, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. The unsung heroes and all that sort of stuff. That's exactly what we're all about. So amazing. Okay, next question. What's the best book you've read this year?
What books have I read this year? They've all been theory books. I'm really sorry. I've started reading Abolition Feminism now, which is fairly recent release, but I've only read a few chapters, so I can't really sing for the whole thing. So I'm going to say the theory book that I'm having the most fun with at the minute is Jay Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure. That's the one I'm enjoying the most at the minute.
Oh, that's a great title.
Isn't it?
If you read their other articles, they've got like the Gaga Feminism Manifesto and everything. They're great. Yeah, I would highly recommend Jay Halberstam.
Awesome. We'll check that out. Love it. Imagine in a parallel universe where geography is not a thing and we're recording this interview in a coffee shop rather than over Zoom. What are you ordering from the coffee shop?
Ooh, it's exciting. I'd probably... It's always been my dream to go to Costa Rica because it's a demilitarized country and it's got amazing nature reserves and it would have great coffee. The only problem is it's abortion law. And I'd probably have some sort of orange polenta cake.
Yeah, good choice. Sounds
Yeah.
good. This is my favourite question. Do you have a pet?
I do. I have a dog called Daisha Abu, and Daisha is part Labrador, part Collie, and he was a lockdown puppy.
Amazing. And follow up, can we see a picture?
Oh, yes, hang on. Picture on the phone.
If you send me a picture, I'll put it on our Instagram.
Okay, I know that the people at home can't see this, but
we will put him on the Instagram. So cute. So cute.
Too cute.
When we record one of our regular episodes, we normally finish with our gratitude list. So in the spirit of that, what is something that you're grateful for at the moment? Apart from your adorable dog.
what am I grateful for? I'm grateful really for the unexpected opportunities that this work with Array has given me. It's taking me to lots of different places this year, and in a funny way, it's given me a little bit more time with my son that I mightn't have normally had. And I'm really grateful that they are the 10 other people that I got to spend so much of lockdown with, because imagine if I'd had to work with a load of melters.
Down with melters.
One of the Array slogans in the shebeen is melt lest ye be melted. So yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
It's fucking amazing.
It does sound like such an amazing group. Okay, the last question is, what is one piece of feminist media, so either a book or a podcast or a TV show or an article or any kind of feminist media that you think everyone should consume?
Ooh, I really loved The Power, in my accent, so Power, The Power, by, I'm terrible with author names. Is it Naomi Oberman? Naomi?
Oh, Naomi Alderman. Yes.
Yes, that's it.
Yes, good one.
Great book.
Yeah, it's a great book and, very interesting. Raises lots of interesting questions. So.
Yes. Also briefly referenced in my PhD thesis.
Oh, very good.
Along with many other feminist books. Amazing. Well, Emma, thank you so much. It's been really lovely to chat to you, and honestly, like I could talk to you all day. There's just so much great stuff there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Emma.
Can I do a little picture of us on screen?
Of course.
Yeah.
Cheese.